The cold came before the light. It was a bone-deep chill that settled in the hollows of Promise Creek, a cold that promised nothing but the hardness of the day to come. It clung to the iron of the railroad tracks, tracing them in a filigree of white frost that seemed to mock the sun, still a hesitant promise behind the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. The air was thin and sharp as shattered glass, and each breath Silas Boone drew felt like swallowing dust and ice. The train was due at dawn, not the passenger express with its velvet seats and polished brass, but the weekly freight and migrant line, a grumbling, soot-stained beast of iron and steam that hauled cattle, lumber, and the weary souls who had more hope than money. It would pause for water and mail, a brief 10-minute gasp, just as the sun cleared the halfway point of the eastern ridge. Then it would pull away, its whistle a long, mournful cry that would be swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the territory. Silas stood alone between the rails, a solitary figure against the immense, pre-dawn landscape. He was a man built of the same unyielding material as the mountains that loomed over him. Wealth hadn't softened him. It had only given him a harder edge of quiet authority. His fortune, dug from a lucky silver strike and bred in the powerful legs of his racing quarter horses, was the talk of the county. But it was a quiet talk, spoken with a mix of envy and respect. He wore a long duster coat, the heavy canvas stiff with frost, its collar turned up against a wind that wasn't blowing yet but was felt in the marrow. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that gave away little. His gloved fingers were curled around a small, crumpled piece of paper. He didn't need to look at it. The words were burned into his mind, traced by a hand that had trembled with either fear or exhaustion. "Meet me at dawn. The station." Just that, no name. But he knew the script. He'd seen it once before, scrawled on a list of medicinal herbs. Elena's hand. The woman whose life had become tangled with his in the space of a few short, desperate days. The woman he had pulled from the brink, only to watch the town push her toward another. The whispers had started almost immediately, slithering through the saloon and the general store like sidewinders in the dust. They said Elena and her sister, Marisol, were trouble. They were being run out, forced to leave after the mess up at the Whitcomb Ranch near the border. No one knew the straight of it, but the story that took root was the ugliest one: a raid, missing livestock, a man found with his head bashed in. The blame, without a shred of proof, had landed squarely on the small community of Mexican and Apache families living on the fringes of the territory. It was an old, ugly song, and the town sang it with fervor. Reeve Dalton, the station master and the closest thing Promise Creek had to a lawman, had made his position clear. Dalton was a man who saw the world in terms of neat lines and timetables. Anything that disrupted the order was a threat. He'd ridden out to Silas's ranch, his face set like hardened clay, and spoken in a low, even voice that carried more menace than a shout. "I've got a responsibility to this town. Boone," he'd said, not looking at the small adobe outbuilding where the two women were recovering. "People are spooked. They want this settled." He'd spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. Best to guide the snakes back into the desert before someone gets bit again. The message was clear. Get them out. The traveling preacher, Reverend Walsh, was packing his wagon, due to leave on a circuit that wouldn't bring him back for 6 months. With him would go the last chance for any kind of officially sanctioned business, the kind that might give a person a reason to stay. Without him, the law was just Reeve Dalton's opinion, backed by the fearful consensus of the town. Silas shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking in the profound silence. He owed her. The debt was a physical thing, a phantom ache in his side where a rustler's bullet had torn through him 3 months prior. He'd been tracking a stolen stallion, got caught in a sudden, blinding sandstorm, and stumbled into a hidden canyon, bleeding and disoriented. He'd collapsed near a small, sheltered spring, thinking his time was up. He woke to a face haloed by lantern light. It was Elena, She and her sister had been gathering herbs in the canyon, while the proud, fierce Marisol had watched him with the wary eyes of a cornered hawk. Elena had gone to work. She'd cleaned the wound with a knowledge that spoke of generations, packed it with a poultice of crushed leaves that smelled of sage and damp earth, and bound it tightly. The storm had howled for a day and a night. He drifted in and out of a feverish haze, the pain a hot, pulsing tide. Every time he felt himself slipping under, her voice had been the anchor, soft, steady, speaking in a mix of Spanish and halting English. She'd told him stories of the stars, of the coyote's cleverness, of the plants that healed and the ones that harmed. She hadn't just saved his body, she had kept his mind from fraying, from surrendering to the dark. He'd left at sunrise the next day, strong enough to ride, with a promise to repay a debt she had refused to acknowledge. A sound, thin and sharp, pierced the stillness, far down the canyon. The train's whistle blew a single, lonely note that echoed off the rock faces. It was the first signal, the 30-minute warning. The sound acted as the town's rooster. A light flickered to life in the station master's window. Another appeared above the saloon. Curtains would be twitching. Eyes would be peering into the gray gloom, wondering what Silas Boone, a man who never came to town unless he had business, was doing standing on the main line track before sunrise. The whole town was a tightly wound spring of suspicion, and he was standing right in the middle of it. His gaze fell upon the freight car paused on the siding next to him. Bolted to its wooden frame was a long, iron lever, rusted from the weather but solid. The emergency brake. It was a simple, brutal mechanism designed to be used by a brakeman on the roof in case of a coupling failure. To pull it from the ground was an act of sabotage. It was an act that would bring the full, crushing weight of the Union Pacific Railroad down on whoever dared. It meant blacklisting, federal marshals, and a fight he might not be able to win with money or reputation. Silas lifted his heavy, gloved hand and laid it on the cold, unyielding iron of the lever. He felt the immense, dormant power coiled within the mechanism, a mirror of the resolve hardening within his own chest. The whistle blew again, closer this time, a mournful, two-toned call that vibrated through the rails and up into the soles of his boots. It was the sound of a closing door, the sound of an ending. He looked toward the platform, toward the passenger car where a few shadowy figures were beginning to board. He scanned the faces, searching for the one that mattered. The cold air bit at his exposed skin, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the weight of the debt, the sting of injustice, and the smooth, cold iron under his palm. A quiet, firm voice spoke in the chambers of his own heart, a vow made to the mountains and the dawn. If she's on that train this morning, he thought, his grip tightening on the lever, I'll stop the whole thing. The memory of 3 days ago was as sharp as the frost on the rails. It wasn't a memory of thought, but of sensation, the punishing midday sun, the smell of dust and parched earth, the weight of a decision made in a heartbeat. His ranch, Silver Mesa, was a world away from the huddled suspicion of Promise Creek. 15 miles of rugged country served as a buffer, a space where a man's business was his own. Silver Mesa was a testament to Silas's nature, orderly, disciplined, and profoundly quiet. The fences ran straight and true, the barn was swept clean, and the horses moved with the calm assurance of animals that knew their master's hand was firm but fair. It was a kingdom of his own making, built on silence and hard work, a place where the only conflicts were with the land itself or the wildness in an unbroken colt. He had built it to be a fortress against the messy, unpredictable nature of other people. 3 days ago, that fortress had been breached. He'd been riding the southern boundary line, checking for breaks in the fence after a pack of coyotes had grown bold. He found them near the dry husk of what had once been Willow Creek, a place of cracked mud and bleached stones. At first, he thought they were bundles of discarded clothing. Then, one of them moved. Elena was barely conscious, her face flushed with fever, her lips cracked and pale. She was leaning against her sister, Marisol, who sat bolt upright despite her own exhaustion. Marisol's eyes, when she lifted them to meet his, were not pleading. They were black, defiant, and full of a feral fire that dared him to come closer. She had a small knife in her hand, the blade chipped, but she held it as if it were a cavalry sword. Her knuckles were white. Her body was a shield for her sisters. Silas had reined in his horse, keeping a careful distance. He didn't speak. He dismounted slowly. Unhooking his canteen from his saddle, he uncorked it and set it on the ground, then pushed it forward with the toe of his boot until it was halfway between them. He backed away and waited. He watched the struggle in Marisol's eyes. Pride fought with desperation. The sun beat down. Finally, her gaze flickered to her sister's face, and the fight went out of her. Her shoulders slumped. She picked up the canteen and, with hands that shook, carefully poured a little water onto a strip of her own torn sleeve, dabbing it on Elena's lips before taking a small, guarded sip for herself. That was all the invitation he needed. "I have a place," he said, his voice low and even, the first words spoken. Water, shade. He brought them back to the ranch not on his horse, but walking beside them, leading the animal. His presence a steady, non-threatening shadow. He'd supported Elena, feeling the heat of her fever through her thin dress. She was limp, mumbling in Spanish, her weight a fragile burden. Marisol walked on the other side, her hand never far from the knife at her belt, her eyes constantly scanning the outbuildings and corrals, searching for traps, for threats. The silence between the three of them was thick with the ghosts of what had driven them into the wilderness. He could see it in the haunted, hollow look in Elena's fevered eyes and the rigid set of Marisol's jaw. It was the shadow of loss, deep and terrifying. He didn't take them to the main house. That was his space, a line he wasn't ready to cross. Instead, he led them to the small adobe outbuilding he used for storage and as a bunk for the occasional hired hand. It was clean, with 2 simple cots, a stone hearth, and a solid door. He helped Elena onto one of the cots and went to fetch his medical kit, the same one he used for his horses and himself. It contained carbolic acid, clean bandages, and strong whiskey. When he returned, Marisol was standing in the doorway, blocking his path. "We need nothing from you," she said, her English clipped and precise. Silas met her gaze. "Your sister has a fever," he stated, not as an argument, but as a fact. "And you look like you haven't eaten in a week. There's food in the house, a stew." He held out the box of supplies. She stared at it, then at him, her internal war raging again. Finally, with a sharp, angry motion, she snatched the box from his hand and retreated back inside, shutting the door firmly in his face. The click of the latch was as loud as a gunshot in the still afternoon. He understood. Trust was not a gift to be given. It was a territory to be earned. Inch by painful inch, he began his campaign of quiet persistence. That evening, he left a pot of venison stew, a loaf of bread, and a bucket of fresh well water on the stone step outside their door. He knocked once, then walked away without waiting for a response. The next morning, the pot and bucket were empty, sitting just outside the door. He replaced them with a pitcher of goat's milk and a plate of biscuits. For 2 days, that was their only communication. He would see flickers of movement through the small window, a shadow passing, a hand drawing a curtain. He went about his chores, breaking a new filly, mending a harness, his movements measured and deliberate. He never looked directly at their door for too long, giving them the illusion of being unobserved, allowing them the space to breathe. On the 3rd morning, something changed. The door opened while he was in the corral, working with the filly. Marisol stepped out. She didn't look at him, but walked to the fence line and watched, her arms crossed. The filly was skittish, fighting the lead rope, its eyes wide with panic. Silas worked patiently, speaking in a low murmur, using pressure and release, trying to find a way into the horse's mind. After 10 minutes of watching him struggle, Marisol let out a soft, low whistle. It wasn't a tune, just a sound, a vibration in the air. The filly's ears swiveled, its frantic dancing stilled. It turned its head and looked at her, its nostrils flaring. Marisol made the sound again, a little softer this time. The horse took a hesitant step toward her, its body relaxing. Silas stood perfectly still, holding the rope slack. He looked from the horse to Marisol. She finally met his eyes, a flicker of something not gratitude, but a shared understanding passing between them. It was a language spoken without words, the language of those who knew the soul of a horse. He gave a slow, deliberate nod of respect. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and went back inside. Later that day, the fever broke. He knew because he saw Elena sitting in the doorway, shaded from the sun. For the first time, the flush was gone from her cheeks, and though she was pale and thin, the light was back in her eyes. It was a fragile light, like a candle flame in a draught. But it was there. She was alive. When she saw him looking, she didn't retreat. She offered a small, hesitant smile that barely touched her lips but transformed her entire face. It was the first crack in the wall of their shared fear. The peace was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. Reeve Dalton rode in as if he owned the place, his horse kicking up dust that settled on everything. He was a thick, solid man who believed that the law was whatever he said it was at that particular moment. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the ranch before landing on Silas, deliberately ignoring the two women who had frozen in the doorway of the outbuilding. "Boone," he said, his voice flat. "Got a minute?" Silas walked to meet him in the middle of the yard, creating a physical barrier between Dalton and the sisters. "What do you want?" "Reeve." Dalton gestured vaguely with his chin toward the outbuilding. "Word is, you're harboring company." "They were in trouble. I helped them." Silas kept his voice just as flat, giving nothing away. "Their kind of trouble tends to spread," Dalton said, his eyes narrowing. He pulled a pouch of tobacco from his pocket and began to build a cigarette with thick, deliberate fingers. "You hear about what happened over at the old Whitcomb place?" Silas didn't answer. He'd heard the rumors. "A bad business." Dalton continued, licking the paper. "Stock runoff. Whitcomb's foreman took a shovel to the head. The folks in town are connecting the dots. They see a raid by a bunch of border jumpers, and then they see two of them show up on your doorstep. They connect the dots they want to connect," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You have any proof?" Dalton struck a match on his belt buckle and lit his cigarette, taking a long drag. "Proof is a luxury out here. Boone, you know that. What I have is a town full of scared, angry people. They want this settled. They don't take kindly to the idea of those women being here. It makes them feel unsafe." He blew a cloud of smoke that hung in the still air between them. He looked past Silas, his gaze cold and hard as it rested on Elena and Marisol. "I can't stop folks from doing what they think is right. And right now, they think running them off is right." The unspoken threat was as clear as a gunshot. It wasn't Dalton he had to worry about. It was the faceless mob the station master was claiming to represent. A group of men, emboldened by whiskey and fear, riding out in the dead of night. "They'll be gone when they're able," Silas said, the words tasting like a lie. Dalton took another slow drag from his cigarette, then dropped it and crushed it under his heel. "See that they are. I'll be back in 5 days to check on their progress." He walked back to his horse and swung himself into the saddle. 5 days. Boone, for everyone's sake." He didn't need to say what would happen if they were still there. He didn't have to explain that his next visit wouldn't be a social call, and he wouldn't be coming alone. The 5 days were not a suggestion. They were a countdown to an explosion. Dalton tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any actual respect, and rode out, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more menacing than any sound. Dalton's threat hung in the air long after the dust from his horse had settled. It was a poison that seeped into the silence of Silver Mesa, changing its character from one of peaceful solitude to one of tense, watchful waiting. The 5-day countdown was a silent clock ticking in the back of all their minds. Yet, in the face of this deadline, a strange and quiet routine began to form, a life lived in the small, deliberate gestures of the everyday, where more was said in a glance or the movement of a hand than was ever spoken aloud. The day after Dalton's visit, Silas was up before the sun. As always, the air in the corral was crisp and cold, smelling of hay and horsehide. He was working with the skittish filly again, the one that fought every touch with the panicked memory of a rough hand. He was making slow progress, his patience a finite resource wearing thin against the horse's persistent fear. He heard a soft footfall on the hard-packed earth and turned to see Marisol standing by the fence, a silhouette against the pale dawn. She didn't speak, just watched for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she unlatched the gate and stepped inside. Silas instinctively tightened his grip on the lead rope, expecting her to startle the horse further, but she moved with a liquid grace, not approaching the filly directly but circling around the edge of the corral, her steps slow and rhythmic. She began to hum, a low, guttural sound from deep in her chest that was less a melody and more a vibration. The filly's ears, which had been pinned back in fear, swiveled toward her. Its frantic stomping subsided into a nervous shuffle. Marisol stopped about 10 feet away and let out the same soft, low whistle she had used the day before. It was a sound that seemed to speak directly to the animal's ancient instincts, a promise of safety in a language older than words. The filly tossed its head but didn't bolt. It took a hesitant step toward her. Then another. Marisol stood her ground, utterly still, her hands loose at her sides. She was not a conqueror demanding submission. She was a part of the landscape, as patient and unthreatening as a weathered stone. Silas stood frozen, a silent witness. He had spent his life learning to command horses through strength, leverage, and force of will. He could break any horse to the saddle, but what he was watching was not breaking. It was a conversation, a negotiation of trust. After a long, suspended moment, the filly stretched out its neck and touched Marisol's offered hand with its nose. She didn't move. Just let the horse feel the warmth of her skin. Breathe in her scent. Slowly, Silas let the lead rope go slack, letting it fall to the dust. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an admission of respect, a recognition of a skill, and an understanding that his money couldn't buy and his strength couldn't master. Marisol's eyes met his over the filly's back. For the first time, the defensiveness in her gaze was gone, replaced by a flicker of shared purpose. She had claimed a space for herself at Silver Mesa, not with words, but with an act of quiet power. While Marisol found her territory in the corral, Elena found hers in a patch of forgotten earth behind the main house. It was a vegetable garden, long since surrendered to weeds in the punishing sun. The tomato vines were withered, the soil cracked and barren. To Silas, it was a lost cause, another chore he hadn't gotten around to. To Elena, it was a promise. He watched her from the kitchen window that morning as she worked. She moved with a gentle, determined efficiency. Her hands, which he had first seen trembling with fever, were now steady and capable. She didn't rip the weeds out but carefully worked them loose, preserving the soil. She found a rusty hoe in the tool shed and patiently broke up the hard-packed earth. He saw her examining the dying tomato plants, her touch as delicate as a surgeon's. She pruned the dead leaves, her fingers moving with an innate knowledge. She found a half-empty sack of bone meal and worked it into the soil around the roots. She fashioned small supports from fallen branches, tying the weary vines up toward the sun. She was bringing it back to life, in her quiet, focused labor. Silas saw the same spirit that had kept him from bleeding out in a sandstorm. It was a refusal to surrender, a deep-seated instinct to nurture and heal. She was not just tending a garden. She was replanting her own roots, however shallow and temporary. into this hard, unforgiving land. That day, for the first time, they ate lunch together. It wasn't planned. Silas had come up to the house, and Elena was on the porch steps, wiping the dirt from her hands. Marisol emerged from the direction of the barn. A silent accord was reached. Silas brought out a block of cheese and the remainder of the bread. Elena produced 3 surprisingly robust tomatoes from her pocket, the first fruits of her labor, which she sliced with Marisol's small, sharp knife. They sat on the wide porch steps, a careful distance between them. It was a space just wide enough for courtesy, but just close enough to share the warmth of the midday sun. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the sound of chewing, the distant nicker of a horse, the buzz of a lazy fly. Silas found himself watching Elena's hands. They were smudged with dirt, the nails broken, but they were graceful as she lifted a slice of tomato to her lips. He then looked at Marisol. Her posture was still rigid, but the tension had eased from her shoulders. She ate with a focused intensity, as if storing up energy for a fight she knew was coming. Then, a small fissure appeared in the fragile piece. Silas noticed a smear of dirt on Elena's cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and gently brushed it away with his thumb. It was an unconscious, almost brotherly gesture, but a laugh escaped Elena's lips, a sound of pure, unburdened surprise. It was a sound Silas realized he had never heard before, and it was like water in a desert. From the corner of his eye, he saw Marisol's hand, which had been resting on a nearby water pail, clench around the wooden handle. Her knuckles went white, her jaw tightened. The laughter died in Elena's throat as she saw her sister's reaction. The invisible border had been touched. Later that afternoon, the tension shifted. Silas had to separate a half-dozen new calves from their mothers to brand them. It was a 2-person job, best done with speed and precision. Marisol appeared at his side as he was planning his approach. She didn't ask. She just picked up a sorting stick and took her position. They worked as a seamless unit. She moved with the fluid instincts of someone who had been around livestock her entire life, anticipating the calves' movements, turning them back with a quick step and a sharp shout that was perfectly timed. They moved in a dusty, controlled chaos, a dance of skill and prediction. Elena had come out of the adobe house and was watching from a distance, her hands clasped in front of her. At first, she was smiling, but as she watched Silas and Marisol work together, their bodies moving in perfect, unspoken harmony, her smile slowly faded. Her hands dropped to her sides. She saw a partnership, a shared language of hard, physical work that she didn't speak. She was an outsider to this part of their world, a spectator to a deep and fundamental connection. Another border, just as invisible and just as real, had made itself known. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the mountains in hues of purple and orange, Silas stood alone on his porch, looking out over the land that was his. It was a vast and lonely empire. He had always taken a grim satisfaction in its emptiness, in its quiet order. It was manageable, predictable. Being alone was easy, he admitted to himself, the thought coming to him with the force of a revelation. The work was hard, but it was simple. Now, nothing was simple. The presence of the 2 women had filled the silence, not with a noise, but with meaning. The food he cooked was no longer just fuel. It was sustenance for others. The roof over his head was no longer just shelter. It was a sanctuary. The quiet discipline of his days was now punctuated by unexpected laughter and the sharp, protective glint in a woman's eyes. With them here, everything, the water from the well, the shade of the cottonwoods, the very ground beneath his feet suddenly had a purpose beyond his own survival. As darkness fell, a deep, velvety blackness pricked by a million stars, he heard their voices. They were inside the adobe, the soft glow of a lantern visible through the window. They were speaking softly, a low murmur that rose and fell in the night air. He could distinguish the lyrical cadence of Spanish, mixed with other, sharper sounds and rhythms he didn't recognize, but assumed was the Apache tongue of their mother. It was their own world, a private space woven from a shared history and a language he would never understand. He was their protector, their host, but he was outside of that circle. He was standing on yet another border. The quiet murmurs from the small adobe house were a world away from the noises growing in Promise Creek. There, under the smoky lamps of the saloon and over the counters of the general store, the whispers were getting louder, twisting the facts into a more convenient and ugly shape. The story of two desperate women seeking shelter had morphed into something else entirely. It traveled from man to man, fueled by fear and suspicion, until it solidified into a single, dangerous question that was beginning to be spoken aloud. "You hear about Silas Boone?" one man would say to another over a warm beer. "Hold up out there at Silver Mesa, with them two outsider women, the rich cattleman and the Apache girl. What do you suppose he's planning?" The question hung in the air, pregnant with insinuation. A man that rich and that alone, you don't suppose he's thinking of marrying one of them, do you? The assault came not with riders and torches, but with the creak of a wagon wheel and the sharp, nasal voice of Matilda Croft. It was the second day of the countdown, high noon, when the sun was a merciless hammer in a white-hot sky. Matilda was the town's foremost widow, a woman whose grief had long ago curdled into a kind of sour righteousness. She ran the boarding house and, by extension, the town's rumor mill. Her arrival at Silver Mesa was as calculated as a chess move. The wagon, a rickety buckboard, pulled up with a loud groan. Matilda hailed Silas from the driver's seat, her voice pitched to carry across the entire dusty yard. "Mr. Boone, a moment of your time, if I'm not interrupting anything important." Silas was repairing a leather strap on the porch. Elena was weeding the far side of her resurrected garden, and Marisol was brushing down the filly in the shade of the barn. All three froze, like deer catching the scent of a wolf. "The back wheels come loose," Matilda announced, climbing down with a deliberate show of effort. She didn't look at Silas. Her eyes, small and hard as pebbles, were fixed on the adobe outbuilding, then swept over to Elena, lingering with a pointed, invasive scrutiny. "Happened just past the fork. A man can't be too careful on these roads. Never know what kind of trouble is lurking." Silas put down his tools and walked toward her, his movements slow and measured. He knew this wasn't about a wheel. This was an inspection, a warning shot fired on behalf of the town. "I'll take a look. Matilda." "I'd be obliged," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She followed him to the back of the wagon, but her speech was directed at the air, at the silent audience she knew was listening. "A decent man like you, all alone out here. It's a shame, a real shame. A big property like this. It needs a proper woman's touch, a respectable woman." Elena had risen to her feet, her hands clutching her skirt. She stood very still, her back to the wagon, but Silas could see the rigid line of her shoulders. In the barn's shadow, Marisol stopped her grooming, her hand resting on the horse's flank, her knuckles white. "You're a pillar of this community, Silas," Matilda continued, her voice growing louder, more performative. "That's why folks are so concerned. They see you taking in strays, and they worry. You know how people talk. They say charity is a fine thing, but you don't invite a fox into the henhouse. Harboring that kind of element, it's just asking for trouble to come knocking. It's a blight." The word hung in the hot, still air. Blight. It was a word used for disease in crops, for rot in the wood. Matilda had made her point. She had walked into his sanctuary and declared its inhabitants a pestilence. Silas finished tightening the bolt on the wheel, his movements economical and sharp. He straightened up and faced her, his expression a mask of cold neutrality. "Wheels fixed. It should hold you till you get back to town." Matilda's sour smile faltered for a second. She had expected an argument, a defense. His calm refusal to engage unnerved her. "Well, I thank you for your time." She clambered back onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and with one last venomous glare toward Elena, clucked the horse into motion. The dust she kicked up seemed to hang in the yard for a long time after she was gone. The silence she left behind was worse than her words. It was heavy and sharp-edged. Elena slowly bent back down to her gardening, but her movements were jerky, mechanical. Silas saw her bite down hard on her lower lip, a small, desperate act of control. He started to walk toward her, to say something, anything, but a sharp movement from the barn stopped him. Marisol came striding out of the shadows. Her face was a storm cloud, her dark eyes blazing with a cold fire he had not seen since the day he found them. She didn't look at her sister. She walked directly to the porch where Silas stood, stopping at the bottom step and looking up at him. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling, though her voice was as steady and sharp as splintered rock. "We will leave." It wasn't a question or a plea, it was a declaration. Silas looked down at her. "Just like that because of her. Because of what she is." Marisol corrected him, her voice tight. "She is the town. She is the whisper that becomes a shout. She is the match that lights the fire." She took a breath. "We will be gone by morning." "Is that what you want?" Silas asked, his voice low. A flicker of something pain, frustration, a deep and profound weariness crossed her face before the mask of anger slammed back down. "What I want is for my sister to be safe. What I want is to not be looked at like dirt. What I want does not matter." She finally looked away from him, toward the mountains. "What is safe is different from what is wanted. You know this." Yes, he knew it. His entire life was built on that principle. Safety was in solitude. Safety was in high fences and a fast horse. Want was a weakness, a crack in the armor. "She is afraid," a soft voice said from behind him. Silas turned. Elena had come up to the porch, her face pale, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. She was looking at her sister with a heartbreaking mix of love and exasperation. "It is not you she is afraid of," Elena said, speaking directly to Silas, though her words were for Marisol. "She is afraid of the choice. Your choice." She took another step, placing a hand on the porch rail. "She has been my shield for so long. She does not know how to be anything else. She is afraid that if you choose me, she will lose her purpose. And she is afraid that if you choose her—" Elena's voice trailed off, unable to speak the rest of the thought aloud. Marisol whirled around, her eyes flashing. "You know nothing of my fears." "I know all of them," Elena shot back, her voice rising with a strength that surprised Silas. "Because they are my fears too. I am afraid of the whispers. I am afraid of the night, but most of all, I am afraid of this silence, this waiting for the axe to fall. I would rather it fall today than live another hour like this." The raw emotion of her outburst silenced them all. The truth of it lay bare between them. The gnawing terror of uncertainty was worse than any confrontation. Marisol's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a rigid, wounded pride. She looked at Silas, her gaze direct and challenging. Stripped of all pretense, the fury was gone, leaving behind something harder, something ancient and unyielding. "Where we come from," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of tradition. "A man's worth is not in the promises he makes. A promise is just air. It is cheap. It can be broken by the wind." She took a step closer, ascending the first step of the porch, bringing them eye to eye. He could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but also an indomitable will. A man proves he is a worthy partner by what he can do, by the skill of his hands, by the strength of his back, by the truth in his eyes when he works. She was not just speaking to him, she was issuing a challenge, invoking a law older than any statute in a dusty book in Promise Creek. She was offering him a way out that was also a way in, a test. "My sister," Marisol said, her voice softening as she glanced at Elena. "She can make a dead thing grow. She can heal with her hands. She brings life. That is her value. It is true and it is real." Then she looked back at Silas, her eyes locking onto his. "I can gentle a horse that you cannot. I can track in country where you would be blind. I can survive. That is my value." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the quiet yard. "Words are nothing. Let us see the truth in what we are, the old way. Show us who is a worthy partner for a man like you. Not with a promise, with a deed." Marisol's challenge settled over the ranch like the profound hush that follows a lightning strike. It was no longer a matter of shelter, but of choice. A choice to be made not with words, but with the silent testimony of hands and heart. The 5-day countdown had been supplanted by a new, more intimate and terrifying clock. 3 days to see, to weigh, to decide a life. The first day of the test began not with a contest, but with a lesson. In the cool, gray light of dawn, Marisol led Silas to the far corral, where the white mare, a beautiful and half-wild creature he'd all but given up on, paced like a caged ghost. She was a horse born of fear, her hide a map of old scars, her eyes holding the memory of every rough hand and angry voice. Silas had tried to break her with ropes and will, and had been met with a violent, desperate resistance that bordered on self-destruction. He had deemed her a lost cause. "She does not need a master," Marisol said, her voice a low murmur as she leaned against the fence. "She needs to believe the world will not break her." She looked at Silas. "You approach her like a conqueror. You must approach her like a mountain. Be still. Let her learn your shape, your silence." She instructed him to enter the corral and simply stand in the center. No rope, no tools, no intent in his posture. Just to be. It was the hardest thing she could have asked of him. He was a man of action, of purpose. To stand and do nothing felt like a profound failure. The mare snorted, her eyes wide, and galloped in a frantic circle around him, kicking up clouds of dust. He stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze soft and unfocused as Marisol had instructed. "Breathe with her, not at her," she called from the fence. "Feel the air she breathes. Let your heart beat with the sound of her hooves, not against it." For an hour he stood there, a statue in a storm of equine panic. Slowly, agonizingly, the mare's circles widened, her gallop slowed to a canter, then a trot, then a walk. She would stop, stare at him, her nostrils flaring, and then start her agitated pacing again. Silas felt a vein throbbing in his temple. Every instinct screamed at him to reach out, to speak, to impose order on the chaos. But he held to Marisol's instruction, focusing on the rhythm of his own breathing, trying to project a calm he did not feel. Finally, the mare stopped on the far side of the corral, her sides heaving. She watched him, her head low. He remained still. After a long, suspended silence, she took one hesitant step toward him, then another. She moved as if crossing a frozen lake, testing the ice with every hoof fall. She came closer and closer, until her warm breath puffed against his shirt. He could smell the sweat and dust and wildness of her. His heart hammered against his ribs. She stretched out her neck and sniffed his shoulder, his arm, and then, with an act of trust so immense it felt like a miracle, she rested her forehead against his chest and let out a long, shuddering sigh. Silas slowly, so slowly he barely moved, lifted a hand and laid it on her neck. She flinched, but did not pull away. He let his hand rest there, feeling the powerful life beneath the skin. He looked over at Marisol. She was watching, her face unreadable, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a profound, shared understanding. For the first time, he was allowed to touch the soul of this wild creature. not because he had demanded it, but because he had earned it. Lunch was a different kind of lesson. While Silas and Marisol were locked in their silent battle of wills in the corral, Elena had disappeared into the scrubland beyond the creek bed with a basket. She returned as the sun reached its peak, her basket filled with an assortment of leaves, roots, and berries that Silas would have dismissed as weeds. She laid them out on the porch, her hands moving with a quiet, practiced grace. She crushed some leaves with a smooth stone, mixing them with a little goat cheese. She sliced a tough-looking root into thin, almost translucent wafers that she crisped on a hot skillet. The meal she served was simple, but it was a revelation. A salad of miner's lettuce and wild onions, sharp and clean. The crisp roots, nutty and earthy. A small bowl of tart gooseberries for dessert. She had taken the cast off, forgotten things of the land and made them into something not just edible, but elegant. As she set his plate down on the porch step beside him, her fingers brushed his shoulder. It was a feather-light touch, gone in an instant, but a jolt of warmth spread through him, a startling contrast to the tense, hard-won connection he had shared with Marisol. One woman had offered him a key to a wild spirit. The other offered him the sustenance that could make a home in the wilderness. One was a challenge to his strength, the other a balm to his solitude. That evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, the three of them sat on the porch steps. The unspoken truce of the day held them in a fragile bubble of peace. They did not speak. There were no words for the complex web of debt, fear, and burgeoning affection that bound them. They were three solitary figures sharing a single sunset, watching the first stars prick the darkness. In the quiet companionship, in the shared space, there was the ghost of a feeling that Silas had never known. It felt, strangely, like a family that dared not speak its name. The second day arrived with a jolt of reality, a reminder of the world beyond the borders of Silver Mesa. The mail rider, a lanky youth named Jebediah, galloped in mid-morning, his horse lathered. He had a letter for Silas, but his news was more urgent. Reverend Walsh is leaving sooner than planned, Jebediah announced, wiping sweat from his brow. His sister's taken ill up in Prescott. He's catching the Thursday morning train, the 5 a.m. 2 days. The news landed like a stone. The narrow window of opportunity for a legal, binding ceremony. The one thing that could give any arrangement the sanction of law. The one thing that might hold the town at bay was closing with the speed of an oncoming train. As if summoned by the bad news, Matilda Croft returned. This time, she was not alone. She brought 2 other women from the town, their faces pinched with the same brand of pious curiosity. They didn't invent a pretense this time. They simply had Jebediah drive their wagon out, and they sat in it at the edge of the property, just beyond the main gate, like vultures waiting for something to die. They didn't speak, they just sat and stared, their eyes following Elena as she worked in her garden, their collective gaze a physical weight, a silent, communal judgment. Elena continued her work, her back ramrod straight, her movements deliberate. Marisol, who had been oiling a saddle, stood up and stared back at them, her expression one of pure, unadulterated defiance. It was a siege of whispers and looks, a battle fought with the weapons of polite society. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Later that afternoon, as Silas was checking the water level in the main trough, Marisol approached him. The women in the wagon had finally left, trailing a cloud of righteous dust behind them. "You see what it will be," she said, her voice low and intense. "It will not stop. They will not stop." He turned to face her. "I'm not afraid of them." "I am not speaking of fear," she said, stepping closer. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. It was not a gentle touch. Her fingers were firm, her palm radiating a fierce heat. It was not a caress. It was a brand. "I am speaking of the price. If you choose me, you choose this fight. Every day, They will look at you and see a man who turned his back on his own kind. They will look at me and see a savage, our children. She said the word with a stark, brutal honesty. Will be caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. This is the price. If you choose me, you must be strong enough to pay it. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then back into her eyes. He saw no romance there, only a hard, unwavering truth. She was offering him a partnership forged in adversity, an alliance against the world. She dropped her hand and stepped back. Before he could respond, Elena's voice called to him from the house. "Silas, can you come?" He found her by the small, shaded spring that fed the well. The air was cooler here, smelling of damp earth and moss. She was standing by the water's edge, her reflection wavering on its surface. "I know what my sister offers you," she began, not looking at him. "She offers you strength, a warrior to stand beside you. It is a great and honorable thing." She finally turned, and he was struck by the raw vulnerability in her face. "I cannot offer you that. The fight, it chips away at my soul. I have no armor for it." She took a hesitant step toward him. "Before you found us, a part of me had already died out there in the desert. The part that hoped, the part that believed in anything but the next sunrise." Her eyes, dark and deep, locked with his. "When you brought us here, when you showed us kindness without asking for anything in return, you woke the part of me that was still alive." She was close now, so close he could see the slight tremble in her lip. "I cannot offer you a shield against the world. I can only offer you a place to lay down your own shield, a home, a garden, a quiet place." She reached out, her fingers barely gracing his arm. "Marisol will help you survive. I will help you live." The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the yard. The light caught in her hair, turning it to fire. He was standing between two choices, two futures, two women who had, in the space of a few days, laid claim to the empty spaces in his life. One was the wild, untamable heart of the land itself. The other was the patient, life-giving soul that could make it a home. He looked at Elena, at the desperate hope and terrifying honesty in her eyes. The weight of the impending dawn, of the departing preacher, of Matilda's hateful stare, and of Marisol's stark challenge all came crashing down on him. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers closing over hers. Her skin was cool from the spring water. The red light of the dying day enveloped them. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "I have to decide." Sleep did not come. The night was a long, silent vigil in which Silas Boone wrestled with the two halves of his own soul. The moon traced a slow, silver arc across the floor of his sparsely furnished room, a silent witness to his torment. He sat at his heavy oak desk, a single lamp casting a pool of amber light, the rest of the world swallowed by shadows. In front of him was a piece of paper, stark and white. Down the middle, he had drawn a single, thick line with a piece of charcoal. On one side, he had written the name Marisol, on the other, Elena. He had tried to be logical. It was the only way he knew how to navigate the world. Under Marisol's name, he listed her virtues as a man might list the attributes of a prize mare or a plot of fertile land. Strength. The word was uncompromising. She was as strong as the mountains that framed his property, her will as unbending as the iron rails of the train track. Survival. She could read the land, find water where there was none, and face down a threat with eyes that never wavered. She was a partner for the hard realities of this life, an ally who would stand back to back with him against any danger. Understanding. She understood the language of horses, of silence, of a world where a moment's weakness could mean the end. She was a mirror of his own solitude, his own guarded nature. To choose her would be to reinforce the fortress he had built around his life, making it impregnable. It was the safe choice, the sensible choice, a partnership. Then his eyes moved to the other column. Elena. The words came more slowly, harder to define. Life. It was the only word that truly fit. She had taken a dead patch of ground and coaxed it back into bloom. She had taken the broken, bleeding part of him after the sandstorm and breathed life back into it. Peace. In her presence. The constant, low-level vigilance he lived with seemed to quiet. The silence of the ranch was no longer empty. It was filled with a gentle, calming presence. She did not reflect his strength. She soothed the weariness that came from being strong all the time. Home. She was not a fortress. She was the hearth inside it. A place to be, not just to defend. To choose her was to open the gates, to let the world in. With all its beauty and all its danger, it was a choice of the heart. He stared at the paper for hours. The columns were perfectly, agonizingly balanced. One was the life he had built. The other was the life he was beginning to realize he wanted. One was a shield. The other was a reason to put the shield down. Logic failed him. The charcoal lay inert in his fingers. There was no right answer on the paper. No calculation that could solve the equation of a human heart. The list was a fool's errand. He had tried to map a territory that had no maps. The lamp began to sputter, the flame drowning in the last of the oil. He didn't move to refill it. He sat in the growing darkness, the useless paper before him, and watched the gray, ghostly light of pre-dawn begin to creep through the window. He hadn't made a choice. He had simply come to the end of the night, and in the quiet, exhausted clarity that comes from a sleepless soul-searching, he knew. The choice had already been made, not in his head, but in the place beneath his ribs where logic held no sway. He rose from the chair, his joints stiff, and walked out onto the porch. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of dust and dew. He expected to be alone. She was already there. Marisol was sitting on the top step, her back to the door. She wasn't looking out at the mountains or the coming sun. She was looking at her own hands, resting in her lap. Her back was perfectly, unnaturally straight, as if held up by the sheer force of will. She must have heard his footfalls, but she didn't turn. The silence stretched, filled only by the first tentative chirps of awakening birds. "I have lost," she said, her voice quiet, devoid of accusation or self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact, spoken to the morning air. Silas stood behind her, his hand resting on the doorframe. The words he had rehearsed, the explanations and apologies, all turned to ash in his mouth. They were useless now. She finally looked up, not at him, but toward the eastern sky, where a faint blush of pink was staining the horizon. "Not to Elena," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of its customary strength. "I have never been in a fight against my sister." She took a slow, deep breath. "I lost to the place your heart has chosen to shelter. A man cannot be commanded where to find his peace. It is a river that finds its own way to the sea." A single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot, slow path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, a lone testament to the pain she would not voice. But still, her back remained straight. Her pride was a fortress that would not be breached. Just then, the door to the adobe outbuilding creaked open. Elena stepped out, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She saw Silas standing in the doorway of the main house. Then she saw her sister, sitting alone on the steps, her eyes still soft with sleep, sharpened with an immediate, intuitive understanding. She saw it all in a single, heart-stopping glance, the rigid set of her sister's shoulders, the profound stillness of the man on the porch, the charged and heavy silence that held them all captive. The choice had been made. Marisol rose to her feet with a fluid, graceful motion. She turned and faced Silas, her expression now calm, her eyes clear despite the tear track that still marked her skin. "Do not," she said, her voice low but firm, "make me stand here and listen to the words I already know. Do not offer me your pity or your reasons. Grant me this one thing, the dignity of my own knowing." Without waiting for a reply, she walked down the steps and past Elena, pausing only to place a quick, fierce hand on her sister's arm. It was a touch that said everything goodbye. Be happy, be strong. Then she walked toward the corral, her steps even and unhurried, her straight back a portrait of unbreakable spirit. Elena watched her go until she disappeared into the shadows of the barn. Then she turned her gaze to Silas. Her face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: relief, sorrow for her sister, and a desperate, fragile hope. She came up the steps until she stood before him. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down into her eyes, and the last of his own conflict dissolved. The truth was simple. After all, "I didn't choose what was easy," he said, his voice rough. "I chose the person who makes me feel alive." The tension broke with a small, soft cry. She stepped into his arms, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, the solid, warm reality of her a stark contrast to the ghosts he had been wrestling with all night. It was a quiet, desperate embrace, not of triumph, but of profound, aching relief. It was the end of the fight. It was the beginning of everything else. But as he held her, his gaze lifted and went past her, toward the barn. He looked at the empty corral, at the space where Marisol had stood just moments before. A fierce and kindred spirit. He had found his home, but he was acutely, painfully aware of the ally he had just lost. The silence she left behind was a presence all its own. The moment was shattered by a new sound. It started as a faint, rhythmic vibration in the earth, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat, the drumming of horses' hooves. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the distinct sound of multiple riders, at least 4 or 5, coming up the main road at a steady, determined trot. There was a jingle of spurs and harness leather on the morning air. It was not the sound of a casual visit. It was the sound of purpose, the sound of a posse. Silas's arms tightened around Elena. He looked out over her head, down the long, dusty road, and saw the silhouettes materializing in the dawn's early light. At the front, unmistakable even at a distance, was the broad, solid figure of Reeve Dalton. And he was not alone. The hoofbeats grew louder, a grim, approaching drumbeat that announced the end of the fragile truce. Silas gently set Elena aside, his arm lingering for a moment in a gesture of reassurance before he turned fully to face the approaching riders. He stood at the edge of his porch, a solitary figure of defiance, his body a shield before the woman he had just chosen. Reeve Dalton reined in his horse 10 yards from the steps, the animal snorting and stamping in the cool morning air. He was flanked by 3 other men. A silent jury assembled to deliver a verdict that had already been decided. Silas recognized them all. There was Blackwood, the blacksmith, a mountain of a man with arms like wagon axles and a perpetually soot-stained face, his presence a symbol of brute force. Next to him was Miller, the general store owner, a small, pinched man whose power came from the ledgers of credit and debt that held the town together. He was the voice of commerce and public opinion. The last rider was Jedediah Stone, a fellow rancher from the North Ridge, a man Silas had shared a drink with on more than one occasion. His presence was the deepest cut, a sign that this was not just the law, but the will of his peers. They didn't dismount. They sat their horses like judges on a high bench, their expressions ranging from Dalton's cold resolve to Stone's uncomfortable, averted gaze. Dalton's eyes swept past Silas, landing on Elena where she stood half hidden in the doorway. He took in her pale face, her trembling hands, and the way Silas stood planted firmly between them. His gaze was flat, devoid of sympathy or malice. It was the look of a man handling a piece of troublesome freight. He brought his attention back to Silas. His voice, when he spoke, was as dry and practical as the dust under his horse's hooves. "Decided yet, Boone." The question was an insult wrapped in pragmatism. It dismissed the sleepless night, the agonizing choice, the very humanity of the situation. It was a foreman's question to a hired hand. Silas felt a hot surge of anger tighten his jaw. He could see the holstered pistols on their hips, the rifles in their saddle scabbards. He was a wealthy man, a respected man. But out here, stripped of the town's polite pretenses, he was just one man against four. He kept his voice as level as Dalton's, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "She's staying." A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Dalton's face. Miller, the storekeeper, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "That's not an answer to the town's problem," Dalton said, his voice hardening slightly. Silas took a small step forward, off the porch and onto the hard-packed earth of his yard. He was on their level now. "It's my answer. She's staying, legally." The word hung in the air, a direct challenge, legally. He was invoking their own supposed rules, throwing the flimsy justification for their intimidation back in their faces. He was declaring that his land was his own, governed by laws bigger than the fears of Promise Creek. Dalton was silent for a long moment, processing this new move. He ran a gloved thumb along his jawline. He was not a man to be outmaneuvered. He saw the path Silas was laying and immediately paved it with his own conditions. "All right then," he said, a cold, thin smile touching his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "Legally it is. Then you'll marry her." It wasn't a suggestion. It was the next logical step in a negotiation Silas hadn't realized he was in. If she was to stay under the protection of the law, she had to be fully bound to it. And to him, an unmarried woman of her background, living on the ranch of a bachelor, would be a constant source of scandal, a wound that would never be allowed to heal. Marriage was the only salve the town would accept. "Reverend Walsh is leaving on the Thursday train," Dalton continued, pressing his advantage. "That gives you 5 days. You'll have the ceremony, get the papers signed, and make it official in the eyes of God and the county clerk. That's the only way she stays." Silas felt a trap closing around him, its iron teeth disguised as a reasonable compromise. Before he could voice his protest, Dalton laid out the rest of his terms, each one a calculated blow. "Until the wedding, she stays here, on the ranch, out of sight. We don't want her wandering into town and stirring the pot. Let things cool down." He paused, his gaze shifting, looking past Silas toward the barn. "That brings me to the other one." At that moment, Marisol stepped out from the barn's deep shadow. She had clearly heard everything. She walked with a steady, deliberate pace into the sunlight, her face impassive, her back straight. She stopped near the corral fence, her presence a silent, powerful counterpoint to the 4 armed men. Dalton nodded toward her, as if acknowledging a piece on a game board. "Her," he said, his voice flat. "She's the real problem, the wild one. The talk in town isn't just about your charity. Boone, it's about her. People remember her temper. They see her, and they see the trouble up at the Whitcomb place." "That's a lie, and you know it," Silas bit out, his control finally fraying. "It doesn't matter what I know," Dalton retorted, his voice cutting like a whip. "It matters what people believe. For this to work, for the town to swallow this pill, the sister has to go. It's the only way to quiet the talk. She leaves. Today." The final condition landed with the force of a physical blow. Silas felt the rage coiling in his gut, a venomous, helpless fury. This was the price of his choice. They weren't just dictating his life, they were tearing a family apart. He looked at the 4 men, at their hard faces, and he understood the cold, brutal calculus. He could fight them. He could draw his gun. Maybe he'd even take 1 or 2 of them with him before they shot him down. And what would happen to Elena? To the ranch, a gunfight would solve nothing. It would only validate the town's fear and prejudice. They would call him an outlaw who had turned on his own, and they would burn Silver Mesa to the ground with a clear conscience. He was trapped. Dalton had offered him the only path that didn't end in blood and ash. It was a cruel, unjust, and bitter compromise. But it was the only one that ensured Elena's safety. The anger in his chest slowly cooled, solidifying into a hard, cold knot of acceptance. As the men turned their horses, their business concluded. A tremor ran through Elena's body. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, horrified relief. She was safe. She would be a wife. She would have a home. And she would lose her sister. The two truths were inextricably, cruelly linked. Marisol, however, did not flinch. She pushed herself off the fence and walked toward the porch, her head held high. She passed the 4 riders as if they were nothing more than rocks on the path, her gaze fixed forward. She did not ask for pity. She did not beg or bargain. She walked up the steps and stood before her trembling sister, a pillar of strength in the ruins of their mourning. Dalton and his men rode away without a backward glance, leaving a thick cloud of dust and an even thicker silence in their wake. Elena finally broke, her voice a choked sob.
"No, Marisol, no, you cannot."
Marisol placed her hands on her sister's shoulders, her grip firm and grounding. She looked not at Silas, but directly into Elena's tear-filled eyes. The hardness in her expression softened, replaced by a fierce, protective love that was more powerful than any anger.
"Listen to me,"
she said, her voice low and urgent, cutting through Elena's grief.
"There is no time for this, no time for tears."
She gave her a small, sharp shake.
"He has chosen you. This is your life now. Do you understand?"
Elena could only nod, tears streaming down her face. Marisol's gaze was intense, burning with a sudden, new purpose.
"They have given you 5 days.
She spoke the words as if they were a gift, not a sentence. 5 days until the preacher leaves. 5 days until you are his wife. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a promise forged in the face of their forced separation.
5 days,
she repeated, her words a solemn vow. And in that time, I will teach you everything you need to know to live with him. I will teach you how to survive here, with him, as his. The 4 days that followed were a lifetime. They were a season of harvest and winter all at once, a period of such intense, focused living that time itself seemed to warp, each hour stretching to hold the weight of a year. Dalton's decree had stripped away all uncertainty, leaving behind only the stark, unchangeable facts: 5 days until the wedding, and 1 day until the farewell. The countdown was no longer about a choice, but about a separation. A quiet, purposeful grief settled over the ranch. Not the loud, wailing kind, but a deep, somber acknowledgement of a coming loss. The work began immediately. There was no time for mourning. Instead, the sisters engaged in a series of small, domestic rituals that were, in their own way, a sacred and final communion. They moved through the days in a seamless, unspoken partnership, their hands constantly busy, their heads often bent close together over a task. Silas found himself an observer in his own home, a silent witness to this profound and intimate transfer of a life's worth of knowledge. He watched them from the porch as they worked to preserve the small bounty from Elena's garden. They sliced the last of the tomatoes and laid them on a stretched piece of cheesecloth to dry in the sun, turning them into tough, sweet chips that would last through the winter. They took the wild onions and herbs Elena had gathered and braided them into thick, fragrant ropes to be hung from the rafters in the storeroom. Every action was a lesson.
"This one,"
Marisol would say, holding up a sprig of dusty green leaves, her voice low and practical. "You make a tea from it for fever. 3 leaves in boiling water, no more."
"And this one,"
Elena would add, her touch more gentle.
"If you crush it and mix it with a little fat, it keeps the skin from cracking in the dry wind."
They were 2 sides of the same coin. Marisol's knowledge was practical, forged in hardship. She taught Elena the brutal necessities: how to properly salt and smoke the strips of venison Silas had brought in, packing them in barrels for the lean months. She showed her which roots were safe to eat and which would send a man into convulsions. Her lessons were about survival. Elena's knowledge was about living. She showed Marisol how to use a pinch of the wild sage to cut the gaminess of the meat, how to use the dried berries to make a simple, sweet sauce. Her lessons were about making a house a home. One afternoon, Silas watched as they sat on the steps of the adobe, a length of heavy canvas between them. It was a spare wagon cover, torn and weathered. Marisol was teaching Elena how to sew with an awl and heavy waxed thread, a skill that required strength and precision. "You must pull the stitch tight, like this," Marisol instructed, her strong fingers guiding her sister's. "Not just tight enough to hold, tight enough that the wind cannot find a way through. The wind is always looking for a way in." As they worked, their murmurs, a mix of Spanish and English, drifted across the yard. They were not just sewing a piece of canvas. They were stitching together the final memories of their shared life, in their quiet, focused industry. Silas saw the deep, unbreakable bond of their sisterhood, a bond he had now irrevocably severed. He was the reason for this frantic, loving transmission of skill. He was the reason one of them had to leave. The knowledge brought him a profound sense of gratitude, and an equally profound ache of guilt. On the third day, he found Marisol in the main storeroom, taking a silent inventory. The space was cool and dark, smelling of dust, dried apples, and leather. She moved through the shelves with a practiced eye, noting the sacks of flour, the tins of coffee, the spare tools. She was assessing his preparedness, judging his ability to provide for the sister she was leaving in his care. He stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice quiet. She didn't turn around. "Yes," she said, running a hand over a rough burlap sack. "I do." He took a step inside. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Marisol," he began, the name feeling clumsy in his mouth. "There is another way. This is my land. Dalton's authority ends at my fence line." He took a breath, the words coming out in a rush. "Stay. Not as a guest, as family. This can be your home too." He meant it. In that moment, he truly believed he could build a new kind of family, a strange, three-sided thing that could withstand the town's hatred. It was a desperate, foolish hope, born of a desire to undo the hurt he had caused. She finally turned to face him. Her expression was not angry or grateful. It was filled with a deep, weary sadness that went straight through him. A small, humorless smile touched her lips. "You are a good man. Silas Boone," she said, and he had the sense that it was the first time she had truly seen him as such. "Your offer is kind, but your kindness would be a cage." She gestured around the storeroom, at the provisions, at the solid walls of the ranch. "To stay here, to watch her live the life to see you both every day, to be the sister, the aunt, the shadow at the edge of your happiness." She shook her head, her eyes clear and direct. "That is not living. That would be a special kind of torture, a slow death by 1,000 kindnesses. My spirit would wither and die in this place." He had no answer to that. Her pride, her fierce independence, was the very thing he admired in her, and it was the thing that made his offer impossible. She knew herself, and she would not be diminished, not even for the sake of family. She walked toward him, stopping just before him. She looked up at his face, her gaze searching. "She is not like me," Marisol said, her voice dropping, becoming intensely personal. "She has a gentle heart. The world has tried to break it many times. It has not succeeded, but it has made her fragile, like a desert flower. She needs sun and clean water and a safe place to grow." Her dark eyes locked onto his, and in them he saw not a challenge, but a plea. It was the final, most important lesson. "Be gentle with her heart, Silas," she whispered, the words a sacred trust. "It is the most precious thing I have to leave behind." The weight of her request settled on his soul. It was a vow he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to keep. "I promise," he said, his voice thick. And that was all? There was nothing more to say. The morning of the 5th day dawned cold and clear. The sky was the color of a pale pearl, the stars just beginning to fade. The air was still, holding the promise of another hot, dry day. A horse was saddled and waiting in the yard, not the wild white mare, but a sturdy roan, packed with a small bedroll and a sack of provisions Marisol had prepared. The farewell was as spare and powerful as the landscape itself. The sisters stood before the small adobe house, the place that had been their sanctuary. Elena was crying, silent tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. Marisol was not. Her face was set, composed. They didn't speak. They simply fell into each other's arms. It was a brief, fierce embrace, a desperate clinging that conveyed a lifetime of shared secrets, of fears faced together, of a love that was as essential as breathing. It was the hug of two people who knew they might never see each other again, a final, desperate attempt to memorize the feel of the other's presence. When they broke apart, Marisol gave Elena's face a final, tender caress. She then walked to the roan mare and swung herself into the saddle with an easy, fluid motion. She looked down at Silas, who was standing a respectful distance away. A quick, sharp nod. It was thanks, and farewell, and a final reminder of his promise. She gathered the reins. "Be happy, hermanita," she said to her sister, her voice thick but steady. "Be happy, little sister." She turned the horse and rode out, not looking back. She rode east, toward the rising sun, a solitary figure moving away from the only family she had left. Just before the road dipped and she was lost to sight, she reined in the horse and turned in the saddle. She looked back at the ranch, at the man and the woman standing there, a tableau of a new life beginning as hers was ending. A sad, beautiful, and profoundly lonely smile touched her lips. Then she turned again, and the dust of the road rose up and swallowed her whole. The world seemed profoundly empty. The silence she left behind was a physical presence, a hollow ache in the morning air. Elena stood watching the empty road, her body trembling with silent sobs. After a long moment, she reached out, her hand finding Silas's. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm and steadying. He looked down at her. Her eyes were wet, but through the tears, they were shining with a clear, determined light. She had lost her shield, but she had found her home. They stood like that for a long time, two people at the very beginning of a new and uncertain world. An hour later, they rode into Promise Creek. The town was quiet, but it was a watchful, waiting quiet. As they approached the small, clapboard chapel at the edge of town, they saw that a crowd had already gathered. It was not a joyful, celebratory gathering. People stood in small, tight clusters on the dusty ground, their arms crossed, their faces grim. They were not there to witness a marriage. They were there to pass judgment on one. Reverend Walsh, a thin, harried-looking man with a weathered Bible in his hands, stood on the chapel's covered porch. He gave Silas a nervous but encouraging nod. Dalton was there, leaning against a post, his face a mask of neutrality, observing the terms of his deal being met. But then Silas saw her. Matilda Croft stood at the foot of the chapel steps, flanked by Blackwood the blacksmith and two other grim-faced ranchers. Her arms were folded, her mouth set in a thin, hard line. She had the look of a general who was about to refuse a truce. As Silas helped Elena down from her horse, Matilda took a step forward, her voice sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Reverend," she called out, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "you can put that book away. There will be no wedding here today." Matilda Croft's voice sliced through the strained silence, sharp and cold as a shard of winter ice. "There will be no wedding." For a moment, no one moved. The townsfolk, who had been murmuring amongst themselves, fell silent. Reverend Walsh, his finger marking a passage in his Bible, looked up, his expression one of weary dismay. He had seen this kind of mob righteousness before, and it never ended well. "Matilda," he began, his voice calm but firm. "This is a house of God. Silas Boone and Miss Elena have come to be joined in matrimony, as is their right." "Their right," Matilda scoffed. Taking another step forward, emboldened by the crowd's attention, Blackwood and the other men fanned out slightly, a solid wall of intimidation. "What right does a woman of unknown origins have a woman who brings trouble with her like a dog brings fleas? We, the decent folk of Promise Creek, demand a delay. There needs to be a proper investigation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "She's right," someone shouted. "Who is she? Where's her people?" Reeve Dalton pushed himself off the post, his face a thundercloud. He had made a deal, an ugly deal, but a deal nonetheless. He had promised Silas a wedding in exchange for Marisol's departure, a sacrifice for the town's peace. Now, Matilda and her followers were spitting on it. "That's enough," Dalton boomed, his voice accustomed to command. "An agreement was made. The sister is gone. The matter is settled. Let the Reverend do his duty." "Your duty is to the safety of this community." Reeve. Miller, the storekeeper, called out, his voice thin and reedy but carrying the weight of the town's commerce. Not to the whims of one man letting this union go forward without due consideration is a risk to our public order. The crowd, sensing Dalton's authority was being challenged, grew louder and bolder. The abstract fear of the Whitcomb affair had found a new, immediate focus. It was no longer about a distant raid. It was about the woman standing on the chapel steps, her hand clutching Silas's arm. Elena went pale, the color draining from her face until she was as white as the sun-bleached clapboard of the chapel wall. She looked small, fragile, a single wildflower in the path of a stampede. Her hand, which had been resting on Silas's forearm, slid down and her fingers curled into a tight, hidden fist at her side. She was withdrawing into herself, trying to disappear. Silas felt a volcanic rage build inside him. He had paid their price. He had stood by while Marisol rode away, had forced Elena to endure the loss of her only family for the sake of this town's fragile peace. And it still wasn't enough. They didn't want to compromise. They wanted a total victory. They wanted her gone. At that moment, as if summoned by the rising tension, a sound pierced the air. It was long, mournful, and achingly lonely, the whistle of the freight train down at the station, signaling its preparations for the night. It was the sound of departure, of escape. The sound gave the crowd a new idea, a single, simple solution that appealed to their desire for a clean slate. "There's your answer," a man shouted from the back. "The train leaves at dawn. Put her on it and let her be someone else's problem that settles it for good and all." A chorus of approval went up. "Aye, the train. Let her leave with what dignity she has left. It's the cleanest way." It was the perfect, cruel solution. It wasn't violent, it was orderly. It allowed them to maintain their self-image as decent, law-abiding folk while still achieving their goal of purification. Silas looked down at Elena. He saw the flicker of absolute terror in her eyes, the realization that her last, fragile hope was about to be extinguished. He saw her future laid bare in that moment, a solitary passenger on a dusty, indifferent train, heading toward nowhere. Her connection to this place, to him, severed forever. If he let go of her hand now, if he bowed to the will of this mob, the vast, empty expanse of the West would swallow her whole. He would never see her again. The decision was not made in his mind. It was a physical certainty that solidified in his bones. He would not lose her. He leaned in close, his mouth near her ear, his body shielding her from the hateful stares of the crowd. His voice was a low, urgent whisper, a secret covenant in the heart of the storm. "Meet me at dawn, at the station." Her head jerked up, her eyes wide with a question he couldn't answer yet. She searched his face and saw not anger, but a cold, diamond-hard resolve. A flicker of her own innate strength, the same strength that had brought her through the desert, returned to her eyes. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. Reverend Walsh, standing just above them on the porch, had overheard the whisper. His shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened. He looked at Silas, then at Elena, and a small, sad, but deeply respectful smile touched his lips. He gave a slight nod of his own, a benediction offered not to the hostile crowd, but to the two defiant souls before him. "The blessings of the Lord," the preacher murmured, his voice too low for anyone but them to hear, "belong to the courageous." That night, the ranch was a place of quiet, determined preparation. There was no discussion of the plan. It existed in the charged silence between them, a shared understanding that needed no words. While Elena moved about the small adobe house, Silas went to his workshop, the place where he mended the hard, physical world. He worked by the light of a single storm lantern. He chose his tools with the care of a surgeon selecting his instruments. First, he found 2 heavy, foot-long steel stakes, the kind used to anchor a main tent pole in a high wind. They were scarred and rusted, but their purpose was to hold fast against any force. He ran a whetstone over their points, not to sharpen them, but as a ritual, feeling their unyielding weight in his hands. They were permanence. They were an anchor. Next, he selected a 20-foot length of thick hemp rope from a coil in the corner. He checked it for fraying, testing its strength by pulling it taut between his hands until the muscles in his back and shoulders burned. He coiled it neatly, the rough fibers a familiar, comforting texture. This was the bond, the tie that could not be easily broken. Finally, he took the storm lantern itself. He cleaned the glass until it shone, trimmed the wick, and filled its reservoir to the brim with fresh oil. It was a practical tool, but tonight it was more. It was a promise to carry a light into the darkness, a refusal to let the shadows of the town's prejudice extinguish what he had found, a stake to hold, a rope to bind, a light to see by. It was everything he needed. In the adobe, Elena made her own preparations. She did not weep. The time for tears was over. She moved with a quiet, solemn grace, her actions imbued with a deep, symbolic meaning. She braided her dark hair, not in a simple plait for sleep, but in a thick, intricate weave that spoke of ceremony, and into the braid she carefully tucked the few, hardy wildflowers she had managed to coax from her garden's small, resilient bursts of color, a testament to life in a hard place. Then, she went to the small bundle of her belongings. From it, she took a simple dress of faded blue cotton. It was the dress Matilda Croft had loaned her when she first arrived at the ranch, a gesture that had been more an act of condescending charity than of kindness. The dress was a symbol of her status as an outcast, a stray. She held it up in the lamplight. Tonight, she would reclaim it. She would wear their pity as armor, turning their judgment back on them. She would not be married in a fine gown she did not own, but in the simple cloth that represented who she was in this town. It was a declaration. She laid the dress out on her cot, her hand smoothing the worn fabric. A quiet resolve settled over her. They had denied her a wedding before God and the community. So be it. There were older, more powerful witnesses than a mob. She looked out the small window toward the vast, star-dusted sky. "We will be married before them," she whispered to the darkness. "Or we will be married before the sky. It makes no difference." The long, dark hours passed. The moon climbed and fell. A coyote called from the hills, its lonely cry echoing in the profound silence. The first hint of dawn was not a light, but a change in the quality of the darkness. A subtle, gray wash began to dilute the inky black of the sky. From the direction of the town, a low, metallic groaning could be heard, followed by the hiss of steam and the sharp clang of a coupling. The train was waking up. The sky in the east began to blush a pale, bruised pink. The whistle blew, A short, sharp blast that signaled its imminent departure. The great iron wheels began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. The rhythmic, powerful chuffing of the steam engine a growing heartbeat. The freight train, the town's instrument of her exile, shuddered and began to move. And Silas Boone, carrying his stake and his rope and his lantern, stepped out from behind the water tower and walked onto the middle of the tracks. The world erupted in a symphony of violent sound, the monstrous grinding of iron wheels on iron rails. A sound that ripped through the dawn's quiet was the first note. Then came the train's whistle, no longer a mournful cry, but a furious, deafening shriek of outrage, a blast of steam and sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. On the caboose, a brakeman appeared, his mouth open in a shout that was swallowed by the mechanical roar, his arms waving wildly. Silas ignored it all. His world had narrowed to the task at hand. He moved with a speed and precision born of a lifetime of working with ropes and leverage. In one fluid motion, he looped the end of his hemp rope through the heavy iron handle of the emergency brake lever on the side of a passing freight car. He planted his boots firmly between the railroad ties, wrapped the other end of the rope around his leather-gloved hands, and pulled. He threw his entire weight, every ounce of his strength and resolve, into the act. The rope went taut with a crack like a bullwhip. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. It was his strength against the momentum of 100 tons of moving iron and steel. Then, with a percussive, groaning clang that echoed down the length of the train, the lever gave way. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A high-pitched, metallic scream tore through the air as the brake shoes slammed against the wheels. The entire train shuddered, lurching violently from side to side like a wounded beast. Couplings slammed into each other with a series of concussive bangs. The freight cars bucked and swayed, their contents crashing against their wooden walls. The train didn't just stop. It was ripped from its forward motion. Clawing at the rails, it slid, wheels locked and screaming. For another 20 yards before shuddering to a final, jarring halt, the locomotive's smokestack belched a thick, angry cloud of black smoke and steam, which billowed out and then settled over the scene like a battlefield fog. The sudden, profound silence that followed was even more shocking than the noise had been. The train stood panting, its great iron heart hissing and ticking as it cooled. It had stopped a mere 10 feet from where Silas stood, a monument to his impossible act of will. A storm of dust, gravel, and hot steam washed over him, peppering his long coat like a blast of hail. But he did not flinch. From the town, the people came, first a trickle, then a flood. They poured out of the saloon, the general store, the chapel, drawn by the calamitous sound. They swarmed onto the station platform, their faces a mixture of raw fury, disbelief, and, in a few guarded eyes, a spark of grudging, undeniable admiration. They saw Silas Boone, a man they thought they knew, standing not as a rancher, but as a force of nature that had just brought the unstoppable march of progress to a screeching halt. Silas didn't even look at them. He let the rope fall from his hands and turned his back on the town, on their judgment, on their rage. He turned his face toward the one person in the world who mattered. Elena was standing at the edge of the platform, just as he had known she would be. She was dressed in the simple blue dress, a wildflower blooming in the industrial chaos. The wild blossoms in her braided hair were a defiant touch of life against the backdrop of iron and steam. Their eyes met across the tracks, across the silence, across the chasm of the town's prejudice, and they began to walk toward each other. He stepped over the rail and onto the platform. She took a step toward the edge. The distance between them was a sacred space, charged with the energy of everything they had endured. The angry shouts of the crowd faded into a meaningless buzz. There was only the sound of his boots on the wooden planks, and the soft whisper of her dress. 3 steps, 2, 1. They stopped, a foot of air between them, close enough to feel the warmth of each other, to see the tremor in her hands, the unwavering resolve in his eyes. A new sound broke the spell, the ragged, desperate panting of a man running. Reverend Walsh, his thin chest heaving, his face red with exertion, stumbled onto the platform. He didn't waste a moment. He came to a halt beside them, fumbled open his worn Bible, and found his place with a trembling finger. He looked from Silas to Elena, his eyes shining with a fierce, righteous light. "Do you?" he asked, his voice breathless but clear, projecting over the hissing steam. "Willingly take this woman to be your wife?" "We do," Silas said, his voice a low, solid vow. He never took his eyes off Elena. The crowd surged forward, a wave of anger about to break. "This is an outrage!" Matilda Croft shrieked, her face purple with fury. "Stop this mockery!" But before the mob could take another step, Reeve Dalton moved. He stepped in front of them, holding up a single, large hand. His face was a mask of cold, hard pragmatism. He had been defied. His town had been thrown into chaos. But he was, above all, a man who understood power. And in that moment, he recognized that the power had shifted. The deal was broken, but a new law had just been written in iron and steam. "Hold!" Dalton commanded, his voice cutting through the anger. "It is done." Matilda stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but for the first time, no words came out. She looked at the stopped train, at the unmovable man, and at the determined preacher. She had lost. She lowered her eyes to the dusty platform boards. Defeated. "And do you," the Reverend continued, his voice growing stronger, "willingly take this man to be your husband?" "We do," Elena whispered, her voice trembling but clear as a bell. "Then, by the authority vested in me," the preacher's voice rose, blending with the hiss of the locomotive's steam, his words becoming a strange, beautiful liturgy set to the music of the machine. "In the witness of this sky and this earth, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Silas reached up and slowly removed his hat, holding it over his heart. He looked down at Elena, into the depths of her soul, and saw his own reflected there. She met his gaze, and a radiant, trembling smile broke through her fear, a sunrise all its own. "I choose to stay," she said softly, a vow more powerful than any spoken in a church. The locomotive let out a long, shuddering sigh of steam, which rose up and enveloped them like a stage curtain, hiding them for a moment from the prying eyes of the world. In that misty, private space, their hands found each other, fingers lacing together, a warm, solid anchor in the chaos. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the entire world, the train, the town, the vast and silent desert beyond seemed to hold its breath. And then, from the engine, a single, clear note rang out. The train's bell, not in anger or warning, but a long, resonant peal that echoed through the dawn. They had stopped a train to start a life. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.